How is divine sovereignty shown throughout the Bible? Have you ever wondered how divine sovereignty is illustrated throughout the Bible? This concept is central to understanding God's role in our lives and the world. Divine sovereignty means that God has ultimate authority and control over everything that happens. It is a theme that runs through both the Old and New Testaments, showing us that nothing occurs outside of God's will or power. At its core, divine sovereignty tells us that God is the supreme ruler who does what pleases him. For instance, Psalm 115 verse 3 tells us that God does all that he pleases. This verse highlights his absolute freedom and authority. In Isaiah chapter 46 verses 9 and 10, we see that God declares the end from the beginning and accomplishes his purposes without fail. This shows his control over time and history. In the Old Testament, we see God's sovereignty in his care and governance over nations and individuals. A great example is the story of Joseph in Genesis chapters 45 and 50. Despite his brothers selling him into slavery, God used those events for good, preserving many lives during a famine. This illustrates how God's sovereign plan works through human actions, even when those actions are sinful. God's sovereignty also extends to his eternal kingdom, which cannot be destroyed by any human or spiritual forces. Daniel chapter 2 verse 44 and Psalm 145 verse 13 affirm this. He governs all things, including nature, history, and human decisions. We see this in passages where God controls the rise and fall of kings and nations, as shown in Daniel chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 20 verse 6. Moving to the New Testament, divine sovereignty is revealed most clearly in Jesus Christ. His death on the cross, although intended for evil by men, was used by God for the salvation of many. Acts chapter 2 verse 23 and Genesis chapter 50 verse 20 applied to Christ illustrate this point. Ephesians chapter 1 verse 11 tells us that God works all things according to the counsel of his will. This means that every event aligns with his divine plan. Understanding divine sovereignty can bring peace and assurance to believers. Knowing that God is in control helps during uncertain times, suffering, or injustice. It encourages trust that God's purposes will ultimately prevail. It also calls for humble obedience and faith, reminding us that God's plans are perfect and that he is actively involved in the world. In summary, divine sovereignty is shown throughout the Bible by God's authority over creation, history, and human affairs. He accomplishes his will perfectly, uses human actions to fulfill his purposes, and reigns eternally. This theme invites believers to trust God deeply, knowing that nothing is outside his control.